Meredith Vieira, you're the executive producer of the new documentary Tower, which is on the Academy Awards shortlist for consideration. Tell us a little bit about the movie and about your involvement in it.
Well, I'll tell you how I got involved in it. My associate, Amy Rapp, came to me and she showed me a bit of the movie, and she had met the director, Keith Maitland, and thought it was something that was a worthy project for us. And I had two reactions. First, I covered Virginia Tech, and I was very, very moved by what I saw, and it stayed with me. So I was attracted to the story, since this was the first mass shooting on a campus 50 years ago. It was August 1st, 1966, and I wanted to be involved in that. But I also had real hesitation when I saw the animation. I thought, how is this going to work? You know, it's such a serious topic, and you're using animation. I came to learn and to appreciate how important the animation was in this film. Keith was trying to tell a story that happened 50 years ago, and there isn't a lot of footage, archival footage. And so he's thinking, how am I going to tell the story and bring the viewer back to that day? And he came up with the idea of rotoscopic animation, because what you do is you use real actors. I'm sure you know this. Mm-hmm. The dialogue is all first person, so nothing's made up. And then you animate over those actors. And when I started to watch it and to learn more about it, I realized that was really the only way to tell the story, to bring you back in time to that moment. And I thought it was just a brilliant technique.
Right, and it is a unique technique for certainly in documentary filmmaking. Right. Let's talk a little bit more about the
overall story.
Right, yeah, for people who may not be familiar with it, the Charles Whitman shootings at the University of Texas in Austin.
Yeah, it was August 1st, 1966. It was the first mass shooting on a college campus. Nothing like that had ever happened before. It took place over about 90 minutes. And Whitman, as you mentioned, and we really stay away from him in the film. We don't talk about Whitman in the film. We avoid his name. I think it's mentioned 3 times. Our goal was to tell the story of the people whose lives he affected. The victims, the survivors, the witnesses, the heroes, and those who chose not to get involved. You know, there's one woman in the film who says quite clearly that day she learned she was a coward. How do you react in that moment of violence? And that was the impetus behind Keith wanting to do this film, to tell the stories that had not been told. In fact, most of these people had never talked about what happened to them 50 years ago until they met Keith.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of you know, the recreating it not just through animation but through these first-person perspectives, it really puts you there, and it's kind of jarring in some instances where you're seeing like a little child talking about his experiences from 50 years ago, and then the way that he, not to give anything away, but
right.
When you find out that he's talking to the real people, can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, that was, Keith knew that he wanted to start the story with Claire, who is the woman who's pregnant, mm-hmm. and end the story with Claire. And at some point you had to move from the animation to the real people. And he knew that in that moment it would be Claire, that person who would propel the story forward. And it is a bit jarring, because you've seen her all as a young girl in 1966, and she talks about that moment where she thinks she's going to die, and then it dissolves into her today talking about it. And that I think that's what had the great impact, that you're there in the moment, and then suddenly you're meeting somebody all these years later who feels as strongly about it as she did then. And it makes their stories that much more compelling.
Mm-hmm. One of the jarring things as an audience member, I think, is that, you know, when this happened 50 years ago, as you said, it never happened before, but now we've become rather accustomed to it. You know, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think when we were talking about the animation before, one of the reasons I felt it worked was it had a surreal quality, and there was a surreal quality to that day because it had never happened before, and people couldn't quite figure out what's going on here. And the next day, the University of Texas, they shut down all the classes, enough time to wash the blood away, and then they resumed life as normal. And nobody talked about it at all. And I think the presumption was it wouldn't happen again. This was some person who was deranged, who did something that none of us can understand, and we wouldn't see it again in our lifetimes. Well, unfortunately, we have. We've seen it over and over again. When Keith decided to make this film, in fact, when he was first working on it, somebody said, who's going to care about a mass shooting 50 years ago? A few months later, Newtown happened, and all those young kids were killed. And there have been so many shootings. I mean, I was drawn to this because of having gone to Virginia Tech and covered that story. And you see them time and time again. And I don't know, how, I think we're always shocked at first, but not really surprised, if that makes sense. And we go through the feelings of tremendous sadness and anger at the perpetrator. And then the two sides form. Those who want more gun control, those who feel their Second Amendment rights will be taken away, and we start screaming at each other. And then a few more days pass and we go back to business as usual. So part of this is not a political film, but one of the reasons it was made was to get people on both sides to take a moment and to talk. Hopefully we want to keep the conversation going, because it only seems to develop when something terrible happens and then it goes away.
Right, and I think that's where the importance of those first-person perspectives come in, is that you really get a personal sense of how an event like this affects people, not just, I mean, we become accustomed.
Exactly, and for years and years and years, which to me was so interesting. There's a scene at the end of the film between Claire and the young man who helped her. And, now it's 50 years later and they meet. They'd never met. This man had literally helped carry her off the pavement. And she reached a point in her life, she thought maybe it was an angel. I'm not quite sure. And so they finally meet all these years later, and he feels guilt that he didn't move fast enough. So for 50 years, he has lived with this, and he did everything right. He was a hero. But to live with that guilt, to me, that was just so interesting to see. And everybody had something. There wasn't one person in the film who at one moment or another didn't break down, because the enormity of it is still with them. And that's true of anybody who, I'm sure, who survives this sort of horror. It can't not affect you, which is why it's kind of sad that the university didn't want it talked about. And back then, probably that was more of a societal thing as well. You move on. There weren't these big, colleges didn't bring everybody in with psychologists and discuss things. Now it's a little bit different, and I'm glad for that you're encouraged to talk about it. But back then, it wasn't like that at all.
Right. So in your duties as an executive producer, I wonder if you could delve into a bit more what those duties entail on this film.
Well, anything it takes is the way we put it to get eyeballs on this film. I mean, all the credit goes to Keith. Obviously, this is his baby. This was his idea. We were brought in to help as best we could with any kind of financing, any sort of distribution, and using whatever platform I have to get the word out. It is so hard for documentarians to get noticed. And because I have a certain amount of access to media because of all my years in it, that was my primary goal, was to champion the film, because I think it's really important and it's extremely timely.
In terms of the budget, I mean, were you able to help him get access to all of that archival footage that he uses in the movie?
No, he did that. We came in somewhat towards the tail end, but whatever we could do. And we're a very small production company as well. I thought, boy, this is David going to David for help, as in David and Goliath, because we don't have a big budget ourselves, but we believed in it so strongly, along with other people, obviously, and offered to do whatever we could. But at the end of the day, what's carrying this film is not me or I mean, we all do our little part. It's the quality of it. It really is, I think, such a well-crafted piece of art. And, if anything, part of my role is, I think people, when they hear the topic, they're like, I can't watch this. This is going to be tough to take. And yeah, there's a lot of it that is difficult to see. But as much horror as occurred on that day, and as much bloodshed and hate, there was so much love that day. And there was so much bravery. You saw every level of the human condition, every single dynamic, from those who lost their lives, the suffering they went through, to the heroism of other people, to the cowardice of folks. And I think, you know, it spans all those human tendencies. And it's also, you know, I always feel funny saying this because of the topic matter, but it's actually a very entertaining film. Do you know what I mean? It's an odd word to use, but it really is. It's a very interesting film to watch.
Right. I mean, it works on that level as being almost like a thriller, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, in the moment reportage, which is very interesting for a movie that was made based on an incident from 50 years ago.
Right. And yet all the dialogue is real. Nothing was made up, and that was very important to Keith. He didn't want to, you know, fake any of it.
Mm-hmm. There's been so many great documentaries this year. I think about 136 were submitted for Oscar consideration, and then this made the short list of 10. So congratulations.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Can you talk a little bit about the power of and importance of documentary filmmaking?
Well, it's to me the best of storytelling. I mean, you're really looking at the human condition, no matter what the story is. That's always at the heart of a documentary. And if it's well done, you know, documentary people always tend to think dry. To me, it's the most vivid of any art form, ultimately, because you're looking at humanity. But it's hard to do. It's hard to pull off. And one of the problems is that often it does come across as dry. And that was one of Keith's concerns making this particular film. You know, the testimony of all these people in and of itself is dramatic, but it wouldn't be enough to draw people in. So that's the trick of documentary, to get your audience inside your story. I think Keith has done it brilliantly. I think OJ, Made in America is another. I mean, you can go through the list. Wiener, I mean, all of them, 13th, all of them are great because they're able to do that, to draw you in and to show you the human condition in a way that is just extremely compelling. I think the fact that there were 100+ documentaries is a very positive thing, and so many that are so great. I mean, the part of me wishes there weren't so many that were so great, because it makes our life a little more difficult, but it's very exciting to see. And you know, it's interesting. We were sitting with a group of documentarians last night who were supporting the film, among them a hero of mine, Barbara Koppel, who is just so brilliant. The first documentary I ever saw was Harlan County, which was hers. And what you see among these folks is such camaraderie. They support each other's films. I don't get any sense of proprietariness or jealousy. I think because they know they're in a very tough field. It's hard to break through. It's hard to get noticed. It's hard to get distributed, all of those things. And so they root for each other. And that was very cool to me. I thought that was a great thing.
Well, it's a great movie, and congratulations on it.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Meredith. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.